So, welcome to a very sunny and very luxurious venue in Birmingham. It's for those of you who've not been to the city before. Lovely day to see it, tour around. Just a few housekeeping messages. We are not expecting any fire alarms, so should you hear a fire alarm, we should exit the building either through the main entrance or off to the right. And I think the assembly point is at the Solomon Cutler Inn. If you've not already found them, the facilities here are out of the door and out to the left. So today, I would also like to thank the KTM for helping really run and organise this event, and welcome to both the people here and those who are online. We've got two people in the room. We have a representative from the KTN who'll be around all day today, so if you want to know what the KTA can do and how they can support you and your business, please do speak to them. We also have a representative from the EEN. I'd like him just to wave to make himself aware, who's only around this morning, so if you do want to know what EEN do, please go and have a chat at the coffee break. And we will be sharing some slides and contact details about the role of the EEN for those who are interested. So today follows a rather formulaic process in that this morning I will introduce the competition. My colleagues from the competitions team will then run through the details of the application process, and they will answer any questions that you have on that. And then we have three talks from the Experimental Cancer Medicines Network, Genomics England, and also the Medicine Discovery Catapult to talk about how they can support applications, or maybe either a partner or as a collaborator, or just simply to learn more about what they do as an organisation. So I should introduce myself. I've been with Innovate for about 2.5 years, and I am Innovation Lead for Advanced Therapies, which means cell and gene therapies. And since I joined Innovate, I've increasingly been involved in industrial strategy work, and particularly the work around genomics. What I want to do today is really just explain a little bit about the background of the competition. I'm not going to go into details of industrial strategy, but I just think it's relevant to see where this competition sits in relevance and relation to the other funding streams that we have active at the moment. I want to talk about the eligibility criteria and the scope of the competition, and this is critically important. We need to make sure that applications fall within the scope of the application, and I'm happy to answer individual queries, but one thing I will be reiterating is if at some point anyone has any queries about the scope or eligibility criteria, that they should really get in touch with us through our support mechanism. There's a specific email from Innovate allowing support questions to be answered, and we are rigorously chased down to respond to those queries, and that gives you written certainty of what the position is, whether the competition is in scope, whether about eligibility, or any other question you may have. There's nothing more depressing in my job than weeding out applications which have fallen outside either the scope, the eligibility criteria, or simply haven't completed the application form correctly. And we really want to reduce the number of applicants who waste time in that way. So we're here to try and help you as much as possible. As well as talking about the scope, I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about data sharing. There is an element in the competition scope that talks about data sharing. It's not scary, and I do want to just tell you a little bit about that. And then finally, as I said, my colleagues will be coming and taking you through in detail through the application process. So just to introduce ourselves really, Innovate UK sits now within the organisation which is UKRI, which brings together the 9 research councils and a new body, Research England, and together we form UK Research and Innovation. We continue with our traditional remit of supporting business-led innovation, but we now sit within the wider family, and you will see at the bottom of the slide we have our nice snazzy new logo, which will be rolled out across all the representative bodies of UKRI. So this competition is funded through industrial strategy and as part of that element. And for those of you who've not been following in close detail, this timeline sets out roughly what's been happening. So on the extreme left-hand side, we have the green paper, which is of course white, and then we have an industry document authored by Sir John Bell, which is really the industry request to the government for support and innovation elements around the industrial strategy. And then in very quick succession, we have the industrial strategy per se, which covers all technology areas, and then a more detailed element, which is around the life sciences sector. And we call this the Sector Deal 1, which was published in sort of late 2017. And then much more recently, the end of last year, we published the Sector Deal 2, which was an update. And the work that we're talking about today, the competition, really is something which is detailed in Sector Deal 2. The funding that supports industrial strategy comes in waves, and you can note and maybe draw maybe an conclusion that wave 1 actually happened before the industrial strategy was announced, but clearly most of the things that were in wave 1 appeared in the Life Sciences Sector 2 deal. Most of the things that were announced in wave 2 and now in industrial strategy, the Life Sciences Sector Deal 2. Just a little bit about how the industrial strategy is delivered. It's delivered, and particularly through Innovate, is through, and UKRI, through the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. So this is a new funding stream, quite different from any funding that we've had before, which is not business as usual. It supports a whole range of activities, including capital investment, innovative research projects, as well as the collaborative R&D projects that you traditionally associate with Innovate. It's really about building the industries of the future. It's not about subsidising industries that are failing or are struggling. It is about building the new industries which will support the jobs of tomorrow. And it's also about spreading that benefit across the United Kingdom. And most of the challenges, or in fact all these challenges, have been defined through business-led challenges. And that's the key strategy here, is that we are supporting and identifying and addressing the needs which have been identified by industry, rather than maybe our interpretation of what industry wants or needs. So just going back to the waves of strategy and the waves of funding, the second wave of funding included a number of strategies, included 6 main challenges, and 2 pilot projects. And the one that's most relevant here is the Early Diagnosis and Precision Medicine Challenge. And that's the one which the funding that we're talking about today has come from. And that covers a number of things, including whole genome sequencing for all the participants of the UK Biobank, initiatives around data, and also Centres of Excellence for Digital Pathology and Imaging. And I'm happy to talk about those separately in the break, but they're somewhat peripheral to what we want to talk about today. So, moving on to the specifics of the competition, which is why we're all here. So we have £5.4 million of funding from the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, which is specifically available to support new developments around molecular approaches to cancer. And we're really looking at the application of whole genome sequencing around this. This was a specific element around which was reiterated in the Sector Deal 2, and something that we wanted to build on very specifically, and this time targeting the support for smaller and medium enterprises. So we've got a range of funding available, and just to be clear, there are 2 basic streams here. We have small grants, feasibility studies, which can involve a single organisation. And then we have larger collaborative projects where the projects can be between £100,000 or £1 million total project costs. And those projects, all the projects need to include an SME. The smaller projects can be collaborative, but they don't have to be. They have to involve an SME. They have to be led by an led by an SME. The larger projects can be led by other organisations, but they must include an SME. Now, the numbers and the figures that we've got there, 50,000 to 100,000 and 100,000 to 1 million, these are indicative. This is what gives an idea of the scale and scope and the ambition of the projects that we want to check and we want to support. But if you feel that you need an extra £10 here or £5 over the limit, talk to us. These limits are not set in stone. They are flexible. But if you apply outside the limits and you don't talk to us, we will simply reject the application. So if you go outside these limits without dropping us an email or having us exchange of correspondence to our support desk, then you will be excluded. So happy to have chats about larger projects or smaller projects, whatever you'd like to feel. If you feel it's justified from a business perspective, then we are willing to discuss that. So as I said, feasibility study must be led by an SME. Industrial research, experimental development projects must be collaborative, must involve at least one SME. What isn't negotiable is when the projects start and stop. So we must have the projects, we want to have the projects starting by the 1st of July 2020, and we need them absolutely completed. There can be no overrun beyond the 31st of March 2022. That's slightly longer than the longest window of 18 months, but that hard stop of March 2022 is a hard stop. There can be no overrun, no expenditure can be incurred after that period. Again, the timings for those projects between 6 and 18 months on average. We want those projects to be carried out in the UK and to exploit the results in the UK. Now, a question that most people will ask is around subcontracting. Can you subcontract outside the UK? And of course the answer is yes, but you would need to justify why that was an essential element of your project and why you couldn't find a suitable supplier inside the UK. And we would always look very closely at any request to move money or spend UK taxpayers' money outside the United Kingdom. It's not that it's impossible, but it's something that we're always slightly concerned about. And again, just to reiterate, if your costs fall outside the limits, the durations are different, or you want to do something slightly different, talk to us. I won't say there's nothing set in stone, but many things are set in stone in terms of the collaboration levels, but please do talk to us. And if you don't talk to us at least 10 days before that, we will just eliminate your application. Right. Project leads. So as I said, and I think I've reiterated a few times, for feasibility studies, it's got to be a UK registered SME, and that's based on the EU definition of SMEs. For collaborative projects, you can be a UK business of any size or an RTO for the collaborative projects. And academics can be involved and they can claim funding, but their funding, they cannot lead projects. So we encourage that. And equally, we would limit the involvement and the amount of funding going to either an RTO or an academic institution to 30% of the total project finance. So collaborative projects must involve 2 organisations claiming projects. That's what we mean by collaborative projects. Not every member of the consortium or collaboration needs to claim money, but at least 2 partners do. And the organisations that are eligible, as I said, UK registered businesses, academics, public sector charities or RTOs, and you can have participants who don't wish to claim money for whatever reason. For multiple applications. So say you've got more applications that you know what to do with and you've got lots of ideas. Well, a business or an RTO can lead on 1 application and collaborate in a further 2. So there are limits to your ambitions here. If you're not leading an application, you can collaborate in 3 applications. For RTOs, the situation is slightly different in that we would also require them to have at least 2 business collaborators, 1 SME and 1 business of any size. There's no limit on any number of applications that academics can be collaborators in. Now, one thing that applicants often get confused about is we talk about costs, and we talk about total costs and grant costs, and there is a terrible confusion that goes on in people's minds. What we talk about for project size is total cost, which is how much money you need to deliver the project. That includes both the funding that you get from Innovate and the funding that you contribute yourselves. So of a grant, if it's an SME and it's a £100,000 grant and you're claiming at the highest rate of 70% funding, then the total project costs are £100,000, grant funding is £70,000. That means that the limit for that project is £100,000 total cost, not a £100,000 grant plus the contribution from the company. Now, I know many of you will be going, oh, well, that's so simple, it's so obvious. But time and again, we get people who get confused by the grant rate and grant claiming elements. And I would hate you to get confused by that. As I said, the other key element to bear in mind is that research organisations can claim only up to 30% of total project costs because they get 100% funding in this system. As a research organisation, we limit them to 30%. And if there are more than 1 research organisations, say 2 universities involved, then the 30% limit includes both of those organisations. You don't get double it up because you've got 2 organisations. Now, scope. So we are really looking for projects that work with whole genome sequence data. Now, that might mean working with existing data, and we've got presentations, as I said, from Genomics England, who hold a significant amount of whole genome sequence data related to cancer. They might work with, involve the collection of new sequence data, either as in part or in total as part of that project. And you might want to consider projects which look at different analytical or reporting tools, working with clinicians and looking at how that data is represented at the element. But it must involve application of whole genome sequence. Similarly, you might want to look at molecular signatures or developing a personalised approach, but everything must be traceable back within that project to whole genome sequencing. You may want to do something in parallel, so something around circulating DNA, tumour DNA, but again, we're looking for something which is related again to the whole genome sequencing from the solid tumours, and this is where Genomics England have been leading the way in that approach. I've listed some specific themes here. These are not an exclusive list of themes. They just provide you with some starters of the kind of things that we would entertain. Again, if you have any queries or questions about what would be in or out of scope, I think we're happy to have that discussion either today or separately. But really what we're looking at is different ways of doing that, and it's for the applicants to decide what are the most innovative or the biggest opportunities that this funding might present. Now, fun thing about data management. There's been a great deal of work around data and data handling and how we could hold data within the healthcare system and this includes how whole genome sequencing is managed and held. And what's become clear is that we really don't want to use public money to generate new small pockets of data which are held and that don't contribute to the overall value of the data set held by Genomics England and others. So what we've asked as part of this competition, what our expectation is that if you're going to generate new whole genome sequence data, that you are in a position to submit that to Genomics England to form part of their data set and therefore contribute to the general benefit and public health good that data set could consider. Now, clearly, there are commercial sensitivities around when you submit that data and how you do that, and we would work with you to look at that. Typically, other projects have had an exclusivity period of around 9 months after the end of the project, but I think we'd look at that on a case-by-case basis. And anyone who's funded will know that we will come and we will talk to you about how the project's getting on, and that would be something we would want to discuss with you around what your data management elements were. What we don't want to do is have that data just sit somewhere on a server and not be generally accessible, because that doesn't benefit anyone from our perspective. One thing, or things to bear in mind when you're generating that sequence data, is that Genomics England, and I see some colleagues from Genomics England in the audience, are quite fussy about the data that they want to hold. And there are 2 key elements. They may want to talk about this in more detail later, but there are 2 elements. One is around the patient consent. So how do we consent those patients? Have they consented to share their data and for it to be used in an appropriate way? And if you've not collected your samples, this would be a good opportunity to think about getting the appropriate consent in place. And the second thing is around sequence quality. So we want to be assured that the material that's deposited as part of the wider database is of sufficient quality to be actually useful. And so I think, again, they could advise you on the kind of quality metrics that are there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use the same methodologies precisely that they've used previously. And it may well be that the data is, the nature of the data is such that Genomics England decide that they don't feel that it's worth hosting that data. But we would like you to be able to offer that data to them as part of the project. What we won't fund. So this is probably a shorter list. It might get longer as we think about it in more detail. But what I don't want to be here is there are lots of approaches which are looking at cancer in terms of using arrays and other forms of rather more targeted genetic analysis. I think it's clear that there's a great deal of scope for really pushing forward with whole genome sequencing. And so we don't think it's appropriate in this competition to support applications which only look at other forms of genetic analysis, either through a targeted process or a panel or an array test. If they can't trace or link the study or the project back to whole genome sequencing and the data you get from that sequence, then I'm afraid in this instance it's out of scope. So no simple biomarker discovery, no simple testing of a different array would be suitable for this current round of funding. Some funding dates. Oh, we've gone out of line at the bottom. So as you know, the competition opened on the 7th of October. The competition closes, and we will hear this several times from the competition team, at noon on the 22nd of January. And that is a hard stop. We close the servers off. If you submit 1 minute after that, you won't get in. Actually, if you submit 1 minute before, you may not get in either. And I don't know if you're going to show the graph. Our competition team normally show a lovely graph of when people submit. I know everyone leaves it to the last minute. I can only emphasize to you that leaving it to the last minute often means that the servers are jammed up and your application sits with the twirly wheel of doom and never to be seen again. So we absolutely, to be fair to applicants, we insist on that cut-off, and there's very little we can do. So if you're going to submit, please do it before then. Our competition process, and we can talk about how those competitions are assessed if anyone's interested, is assessed independently by external experts. We would look to notify applicants on the 3rd of April, and at that point we would expect you to start processing and delivering on all the things you need to do to set that up, and that means that we want projects to start by the 1st of July. If it's a collaborative project, I would encourage you to consider your collaboration agreements well beyond that date, and at least have them in principle, because they tend to take longer than you might think, and we insist that they're in place before that project can start. And we are really getting quite strict on starting those projects on time. It absolutely is dependent on us to get that funding delivered to the spending profiles that we rely on. And so we insist that companies will be able to start then, and we get very stroppy if you don't. Thank you. So I don't know if there are any questions now or whether we want to move on to the competition. There's a question at the back. The question is, will we be affected by Perdus? So UKRI is governed under slightly different rules, in the sense that under the Haldane principles, ministers approve the broad spending portfolio, but don't, under traditional circumstances, dive into the details of those funding processes. So since this process is in train and been announced, it shouldn't make any difference from that. I'm not aware of any difference. I'm looking at my colleague. She's not screaming and shouting. So I think we are outside the Perdus. What we wouldn't be able to do during Perdus, for example, would be to announce winners of grant competitions. That would be deemed to be promotional activity and could be seen as party political. Yes.
The end date, is that that you're in July 2020, is that beyond that date you can't draw down any further expenditure, or would you expect all outputs from the project at that point?
No, so we have a hard endpoint of March 2022 for the grant funding. So the question was, well, the endpoints and when that grant funding would be drawn down and how that works. So we expect projects to finish by then. That means that they've incurred all that expenditure and paid it out from themselves. So we pay in arrears by that date. We might expect outputs from those projects to go on beyond that. And in fact, by getting funding through the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, anyone who's successful has actually signed themselves up to us regularly coming and annoying them to ask them for information of how they've got on, what have the impacts been, and have they actually been able to commercialise the projects that they've been looking at. And that's a key element that we have to think about in terms of how we justify gaining funding and prove and demonstrating that this is actually value for money for the taxpayer. Are there any questions online? Do we know if there are any questions online? No? No? Okay. So I'm going to hand over to my colleagues from the competitions team who will run us through the application form. But if you have any other questions, I'm around all day, so we'll be able to follow up with you.
Right, thank you all for coming along today. My name's Fiona Newbury and I'm a portfolio manager within the competitions team. I'm joined today by Julie Brown and between us we'll be taking you through the process of how to apply for the competition and various rules about the finances and how you fill in your application form. So Ian has obviously already gone through the scope, and I will be covering off some of the eligibility requirements again, just to reiterate the information. So in this particular competition, you are not allowed to do a resubmission, and a resubmission is an application that Innovate UK judges as not material different from one that you've already submitted before. But it can be updated based on the assessor's feedback, but must be different from the previous one. So what is not a resubmission? So it's a brand new application, project or idea that you've not previously submitted into an Innovate UK competition, or a previously unsuccessful or ineligible application. Ian talked about the eligibility requirements. Again, we are quite strict. So if, for example, you've overspent, or you haven't included the right collaborations within the partnership, that will be classed as ineligible, but it can then be resubmitted into a future competition. Has been updated based on assessor feedback, but again, it must be significantly different from the previous application. And it fits within the scope of this competition. So, as Ian's already mentioned, we've got feasibility studies and collaborative research and development. If it's a feasibility study, it can be either single or collaborative. However, it must be led by an SME. But again, it can be collaborative and have other businesses or RTOs involved as well. And the total eligible costs for this particular section are between 50,000 and 100,000. And as Ian's already mentioned, based on, that's got to be your total project costs with both the grant funding and your own contribution. And for collaborative research and development projects, the lead can be a business of any size or an RTO. However, it must have an SME within the collaboration. And the total eligible costs for that particular section are between 100,000 and £1 million. Again, as Ian's mentioned, the project will start by the 1st of July 2020, and it is a hard stop on the 31st of March 2022, which means that all of your grant funding must have been claimed before that particular date, or has to be spent. They can last between 6 and 18 months. And you must carry out your project in the UK and exploit results from or in the UK. So this is just a chart to say the type of organisations that we will fund. So if it's a business, whether it's a small, micro, medium or large, as defined by the EU definition. And there is a link on the slides to clarify that for you. Research organisations, public sector organisations and charities doing research activity. And again, there is a link to the EU definitions of what a business is. And it's very important that you follow that through as to your sizing, because the size of your business will also determine the amount of funding grant that you can receive. So eligibility for state aid, and so in order to be eligible to receive state aid, you must pass the undertakings in difficulty test. And this only applies to limited liability companies that are more than 3 years old. However, if you have a parent company the test can be performed on your parent or holding company. And you should make sure that your business is eligible before you submit an application. It's very important to include the correct size of your business, as that can then cause problems later on when we look at the undertakings and difficulties. So, participation rules. The aim of state aid scheme is to optimising the level of funding to business and recognise the importance of research-based projects. As Ian's already mentioned, you can claim up to 70% of the total eligible project costs, dependent on the size of the business. And for this particular project, the maximum level for research organisations is 30%. So again, that will be checked. And if you go over 30%, that could actually mean that the project might be ineligible. So what exactly do we mean by collaboration? So for something to be collaborative, there must be at least 2 organisations claiming grant within the application, including the lead. A business or RTO-led consortium, which may involve both business and the research base, and evidence of effective collaboration. And so you'll need to explain in your application how all parties will contribute to the project and benefit from the collaboration. Feasibility projects do not have to be collaborative, but if they are single applications, they must be an SME. On the subject of the collaboration, it's really advisable that you work on your collaboration agreement at the start of the project, even before you submit it. It tends to be one of the hardest bits to finalise, and if we don't have that collaboration agreement, we can't actually award the funding letter. So making more than one application, as Ian's already mentioned. So any one business can be involved in up to 3 applications to this competition, but can only be the lead partner in one application. Any one research and technology organisation may only be the lead partner in one application, but there must be 2 other businesses involved, one of which must be an SME. And if a research and technology organisation is not the lead on any application, they can partner in any number of applications. On this subject, if you've got any other UK projects going on at the moment, if you have an outstanding final claim and or an independent account report, an IAR, on a live Innovate UK project, you will not be eligible to apply for grant funding in this competition as a lead or as a partner organisation. And if you've applied to a previous competition as the lead or sole company and were awarded funding by Innovate UK, but did not make a substantial effort to exploit the award, we will award no more funding to you. And the key dates, just to reiterate again, the competition is already open. Got the briefing event today, and the submission deadline is the 22nd of January, dead on 12 noon. And please don't give us heart attacks on the day, because watching them as the minutes tick by and thinking, submit. So the applicants will be informed on the 3rd of April 2020. So now I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Innovation Funding Service. Now, you've probably seen these pages before. So basically, you just log on to Innovate UK and you can search for the competition simply by putting in keywords. That will take you to a summary of the competition, and then you can just click in and sign up to make an application to it. Now, if you haven't already created an account, which presumably you would have, you just basically sign in to create it. To apply for a competition, the lead applicant will need to create an account, and if you've applied for previous competitions, you can simply sign in. You can use Companies House to look up to search for your organisation, to save typing in the name and address. If you're not on Companies House, you can manually enter your information, and I believe the academics and RTOs, it's probably more advisable that they manually enter their details. It's very, very important that you try and give as much information when you're setting up your account. We really want to see your competition company's house number. We want to know what size of business you are. Again, to just reiterate, the size of the company will depend on how much grant you can get, and it will also speed up the UID, which is the Undertakings in Difficulty process. So, when you actually go in to look at it, what you're going to be seeing are your project details. So you've got your application details, and you just make sure you've got your correct research category, as that's, again, going to determine what grant value you're going to get. So if you've put in as a feasibility and you're not actually you're a collaborative, then that's going to cause a problem and your competition might get rejected on that basis. So the application details, title, whatever title you're going to be using, your timescales and your research category, the project summary, short story or summary and objectives of the project, including what is innovative about it, and the public description. The description of your project, which will be published if you are successful. So obviously make sure that it's purposeful. Try to avoid naming names or anything like that. Bear in mind it's going into the public domain. Now, those first 4 items are not scored. They are there to give the assessors a sort of an overview of your project and to get the scene set for them to go forward and make the assessments. And scope, how does your project align with the scope of this competition? And if your project is not in scope, it will be ineligible for funding. If you've got any queries on that scope aspect, if you just email into our customer services and we can pass that on to the right people to check on that. I'm sure KTN would also be able to give you some support. There's some basic 10 questions ranging from the need or challenge, approach and innovation, team and resources, market awareness, outcomes and routes to market, wider impacts, project management, risks, added value, and costs and value for money. And Julie will be going through each of those shortly. You've also got an opportunity to add appendices to 4 of the questions. And again, this just allows you to get a little bit more information out and give the assessors a bit more understanding of your project. So use those appendices wisely and try to get as much information in as you possibly can. They are limited in size, but each of the questions will advise you on what you can actually put in, whether it's 1 page, 2 page or 4 page. So I'm going to hand over to Julie now for application finances.
Thank you, Fiona. Okay, just a quick note. Hi, and welcome everybody. Quick note on the application form. I'm not going to go through each of the questions, but within, once you go into IFS, under every single question there's huge detailed guidance. So please make sure that you read the guidance and you include every little bit of the guidance within your answer. It's well worth it because that's what the assessors are looking for. Okay, so to claim funding, your business doesn't necessarily have to be registered with Companies House when you apply, but it must be registered by the time that you are going to be eligible for claiming the grant. So when you receive the funding. Just to note, you can't receive any funding if you're an overseas organisation. So your company number, registration number begins with FC, or you're set up as a branch to your company. So you've got a company registration number that starts with BR, or your company is based in Jersey. So again, your company registration starts with JE. Okay, so now I'm going to go through all the finances. So for labour, here we need you to enter the role within the project, the gross annual salary, the number of staff and days to be spent on the project. It then automatically calculates the total costs. If you have multiple people in the same role on the same average salary, you enter this in the role within project field. If your employee is part-time, you should enter their costs as a full-time equivalent. You can adjust the working days per year from the default if it is different for your project. Please note that dividends, bonuses, expenses and non-productive time cannot be included within your labour costs as they are ineligible. When making claims against labour costs, actual costs claimed must be supported with timesheets. Okay, overheads. Innovate UK defines overheads as either indirect or direct. We have 3 ways of you being able to actually claim your overheads. As you can see there with the radial buttons, we've got no overheads, we've got 20%. You select that, it will just attribute 20% across the whole board of your costs, or you can calculate your overheads yourself. We do class indirect as those costs associated with the back office functions, such as finance and HR, whose primary function is to support the running of a business. They can only claim a portion of their time and their work, and it needs to be additional to the delivery of the project, so not business as usual. Typically, these costs are not directly related to a particular service or I should say a particular project or service production. Direct overheads are costs associated with staff working directly on the project, for example, desks, office facilities. We do supply a simple form on which you can list out each type of direct overhead with the methodology and the basis to apportionment to this particular project. Again, these overheads would not be incurred if the project does not happen. Okay, material costs. Here we'd like you to enter and describe which materials you intend to use on the project, the volume and the cost. The materials listed must be project specific. Please provide as much information as possible. For example, we have this a lot. Just putting consumables and a total cost isn't enough. We actually will ask you, project finance, if you are successful, to actually split those costs as much as possible. So please bear that in mind, because that will save time if you do actually list all your costs out. Any items you would usually depreciate must be done as per your company's policy and should be listed in capital usage. Materials supplied by associated companies or subcontracted from other consortium members must be listed at cost, excluding any profit element or margin. Okay, capital equipment usage. Here you need to describe how you're using the equipment, whether it is new or existing, the new purchase cost and how long you're depreciating it over, and the residual value at the end. These calculations, again, will need to be in line with your accounting practices. Okay, subcontractors. Again, Ian mentioned subcontractors. We're happy for you to have subcontractors outside the UK, but again, you need to explain in the application form for our assessors why you are actually using non-UK subcontractors and explain the cost. So you need to justify and quantify why are you actually using them. If you use a parent or a sister company, please ensure that you list at cost and do not include any profit. Travel and subsistence. Here you need to include things such as essential meetings that need to happen within the project. You cannot include any sales or marketing activity as this is ineligible. Travel costs must be economy, and you should be prepared to provide a breakdown. Again, if our project finance team usually want to see breakdown of subsistence, travel, hotels, accommodation and such like. So just provide as much detail as you possibly can. Other costs, please check the finance guide for which costs can be included here. If you're unsure, please do not hesitate to contact our customer support service. But here you can have other costs which don't fit in the previous categories. For example, training directly attributable to the project, licensing new technologies, or maybe patent filing for new IP. But please ensure there's no double counting and all the costs are justified. Again, just to reiterate what we've said all along, the size of your business and the type of research that you will be doing will determine the amount of funding that you will receive. So can you make sure that you get that correct at the beginning of your application? Okay, this is a bit of, this is just another check, to be honest, just a table of how that all works out. So if you are a business undertaking economic activity for technical feasibility and industrial research, again, if you are a small, you can have 70, medium 60% funding, large 50. Experimental development, because it's slightly closer to market, you don't get as much funding. So micro, small 45, medium 35, large 25. If you're a research organisation not undertaking economic activity, universities, you can get 100%, which is 80% of their full economic costs. Other research organisations can claim 100%, but there is a caveat. You must be non-profit distributing, disseminate the project results, and explain in the application form how you're going to do this. Public sector or charities, again, undertaking non-economic activity, they're eligible for 100% funding, but again, they must be performing research activity and disseminate the project results, and again, explain in the application form how they are going to do this. Please ensure the eligible costs do not include work costs already funded from other public sector funded bodies. Okay, academic partners. Academic partners will need to fill in a GES form, which they should be all familiar with. The form validates the costs for us. Innovate UK does not have access to the GES system to extract the information ourselves, so we expect the universities to go in there, use the form, and then put the information into our IFS system. Okay, when they've completed their GES form, academics will need to include their unique reference number on IFS and input their figures. They have to ensure that the figures that's on the form are exactly the same as what they put into the IFS, and they must send their GES form, attach it to IFS, their GES form with a with council status. And it's not just the form they need to provide, they also need to provide the justification of resources and the pathways to impact on the GES form, because this is the information that the assessors will look at. Again, like we said, we don't actually own the GES system, so if you have any queries, any of your academics have any queries, please do use the helpline, which we've provided the link there and the phone number, and they'll only be too happy to advise. So, submitting your application. Okay. This is a summary of the project costs available to all the organisations in the project. You'll not be able to see any more detail or breakdown of anyone else's costs. This is also what the assessors see. As you can see there, highlighted is, I think in red, if I can see there, is the total project costs, which, be mindful, it's not the total grant, it's the total project costs. I think we've double counted here, but ensure the highlighted cost fits the criteria for this competition. So for feasibility, we're allowed 50,000 to 100,000, and for CR&D, we're allowed 100,000 to 1 million. For collaborative applications, IFS will highlight to the lead applicant who is actually outstanding completing their finances. You can see there in the top it says that they haven't completed their finances, so the lead can check and make sure, especially if you've got a large consortium, that your consortiums are completing all their sections and marking them as complete all the way through, because it happens quite a lot. You get right to the end, you want to submit your application, you've completed yours, but one of your partners hasn't completed theirs. It will not submit. So you need to be really wary of this. Also, you need to check that your research participation costs are within the required limits. If your researcher participation is above the 30%, you will get a box that will come up and actually tell you that. You still are able to submit your application even if it is over. It doesn't necessarily validate the costs for you. It won't stop you actually submitting the application, but it's just there as a trigger and a highlight to say, no, your research participation is over the amount that's permissible in this competition. So it is down to the leads, and it's your responsibility to make sure each of your partners have put in the correct costs and that you are within the eligibility criteria for this competition, or you will be made ineligible. Here's our favourite slides. Submit your application early. Again, we just cannot say enough. We sit time and time again watching the applications come in, and it gets to like 2 minutes, 1 minute, 2, and people are still trying to put their application in. Like we say, there's a lot of traffic on the day. You can experience issues. Our customer support service are all waiting. We have a big team of people on close day. They're always there waiting on the phones. But if you're, I think you called it the Wheel of Doom. If you have the Wheel of Doom and you try and get through to us, and there's a lot of applicants trying to get through at the same time, you will not be able to submit your application. And at 12 on the dot, it closes, and there is nothing we can do, absolutely nothing we can do. So please try and put your application in earlier than 12 o'clock. Assessment. Like we said, each of your applications will be assessed by 5 assessors. They are drawn from academia and industry. The innovation and the sector teams will be allocating the correct assessors to your application. So please be assured that the assessors, they will have the required skills and experience and knowledge to be able to assess your applications. A little bit about that on the scoring. We do review the scores and the feedback to check assessors are adhering to our guidelines and scoring fairly. In some cases, we, and I'll show you an example in a minute, if we feel that a score is unjust or the feedback isn't correct, we will actually sit down with the innovation lead and the sector teams to discuss that. And there could be an occasion where we think it's, we would class it's an outlier, so they're completely outside the other 4 assessors, and we will take that score out. But bear in mind, that could make your applicant score either go up or down. This is a table which shows a small excerpt from our panel sheet. So once all the applications are in with all the assessor scores, the 5 assessor scores are averaged, and you have a total score. As you can see there, the top, I think on your left, 84.4. The score spread, that is the difference between the lowest assessor score and the highest assessor score. Anything over 30, highlighted in red, we're actually obliged to look at. So we will sit down and review all this and have a look, again, with the innovation leads and the sector teams to discuss whether or not they feel that the score and the feedback given are justified in line with all the other assessors. It could be, and it has happened, that that assessor has seen something that no one else has seen. So that assessor could be correct and the other 4 just haven't seen that. So that is something that we sit down and review. Just to give you another view here, as you can see, this is the 5 assessor scores. So this is the 5 assessors who have scored an application. The green box highlights a particular assessor score all the way across the questions. The purple box is the assessors looking at one particular question. So you can see assessor 1 there has scored it a 10, and assessor 3 has scored it a 6. So that's quite a difference. Highlighted in red, the 62 is where we can see a score difference of 20 or more between all the other scores. So this is why we would highlight this to the innovation lead, to the sector team, and say, look, this could be concerning. We need to go in and actually have a look and review the scores and the feedback to make sure that they are in line with everything else, and that we're happy that that assessor understood the question and was confident in their assessing. So really, the reason we're showing you all this is just to make you aware that we're very diligent, and we like to know that our assessors are doing the work correctly, and that we have got the correct assessors actually assessing your applications. So this is part of our due diligence checks as such. Whether you are successful or unsuccessful, you will receive feedback. It will go back to the lead. So the lead will get the email on IFS that will tell them that the feedback is available, and you'll be able to see the feedback from the 5 assessors there. And then it was up to the lead to make sure that the rest of the consortium has the information. So, project setup. I will assume that all of you will be super successful, and that you will all get successful notifications. This, and I cannot stress this enough, this is where the hard work begins. When you are successful, you have 30 days to put, and I'll go through that, the information up that we're requesting, and then we have 90 days for your project to start from when you get your notification, and where your project needs to start is 90 days. If you do not get your project up and running by 90 days, your funding could be withdrawn. And that is something we are adhering to. So, there's 8 steps to complete. All of your grant claiming applicants within your consortium has to complete this. Must be completed within 30 days is the project details and the project team information, which I'll go through in a minute. We will require information on your bank accounts, so we're more than likely asking you to verify that you have a business bank account, and we're asking for redacted bank statements. We will also be assigning you a monitoring officer who will work really closely with you in helping you get all the information up, your collaboration agreement, your exploitation plan, looking at your spend profile. So there's quite a lot of information here that you need to provide. Also, project change requests cannot be submitted before the grant offer letter is issued to you. So if there is a change in partner, there's a change in costs, we would ask you to withdraw your application and to go into the next competition, because we cannot do any project change requests before the grant offer letter is issued. So that's something you have to think about before you apply. So for project setup, again, we've asked that these must be completed within 30 days of notification. So you need to allocate a project manager and a finance contact. This is so that we can contact you through your IFS. Once you have your own dashboard and you are successful, all the questions will go through IFS. So we need to understand who's going to be looking after that, and you monitoring that system constantly to make sure that you're giving us good answers in a really quick time frame. Collaboration agreement, I don't think we've mentioned it enough. This does stop a lot of projects from progressing to the grant offer letter. You must start thinking about that now. It has to be in place and signed before your grant offer letter is issued. And this is something the lead needs to take control of and make sure, especially if you've got a large consortium, because that's where it gets quite confusing, trying to get all those people together. But that must be signed, so we were unable to issue it before the grant offer letter without the collaboration agreement in place. One thing to note, that we do pay all grants quarterly in arrears. If you are a small business, this can catch you out. So you have to manage your cash flow. The pattern, or as it says, another thing to bear in mind, that all costs have to be incurred and paid between the start and end date of the project. And this is just another word on project change requests. We're just really pushing this point. So we're unable to process any of these before the grant offer letter is issued. UID, one of the biggest failures on UID, and this it's because we're just looking to see if your company is viable, is not putting a company registration number in and the size of your business at the very start of the application. If you do that, you won't have any problems with UID as much as, I say that, you won't have as many problems, so I'm not sure what I'm saying now. So, questions. Our customer support service team are available Monday to Friday. Any questions that go through them, it will go through for scope, for process, for finance queries especially. Please do send your queries into that email address. They have 48 hours to make sure that they come back to yourselves with a comprehensive answer, and they will ensure that the question goes to the correct people. So for process, it will go to Ian. For us a process, I say scope Ian, and our project finance team, they'll make sure that you get a really good comprehensive answer. So please do use them. KTN, invaluable, as I'm sure that we'll find out later on today when you're doing networking, and they have facilities where they're able to read your application and help you with your application process as well. So please do use those. I think I've said enough now, so thank you very much. Appreciate that. I don't know if we're having questions now. I'm just going to grab my badge.
Are there any questions at this stage in the room?
For the academic partners, how can they find out if they've been blackballed? Because their organisation could have been involved in any number of previous Innovate competitions, but they wouldn't necessarily know if those competitions had done what they were supposed to.
I think I don't actually know. I'm trying to think now, because we do our due diligence after you've been successful. So if you are successful, you've been assessed and you've got the quality line, and we send you the notification, that's when our due diligence starts. So our project finance team will actually work with you and look through whether or not they'll work with the sector team, so they'll understand whether or not you've exploited before, or you've got any outstanding IARs, or there's issues with your viability in your business and things like that. So that's where I think those checks take place.
Yeah, I think it's very so the question is around how would academics know whether they would be eligible, whether there have been issues. I think it's extremely unlikely that we would want to take a university-wide or an institution-wide approach. We would look on the individual teams, and I think if anyone's got any specific concerns that they know that there have been problems within their department, for example, just let us know and we can check that out. But I can't envisage that being a real problem.
And the other question I had was, the costs for academic partners seem to assume that those costs will be university-based costs, but some of the costs associated with whole genome would be within your process to be able to direct funding towards hospital set?
So the question is around, sorry, I'm just repeating because we don't have a microphone. So the question is around whether there's NHS or hospital costs, and the answer would be yes, they could be, and you would apply either as an academic, as a clinical research academic, for example. I'm sure that would be an eligible institution, and again, 100% funding would count there. So sorry.
No, please do.
Presumably all this information that's on the slides is available on the website, and there's no, for example, added value in having the slides if they would be available.
So I'd say you're right. The answer is that there is information available on our website. It's in various formats, so you might need to dot around. We will be circulating the slides to all the participants just so that of this event, to provide you with a reminder of what you've heard today. But as I said again, if there is anything that's unclear, please do come back and ask us again.
On the competition webpage, so when you go and you look for search for latest funding opportunities, and it will take you through to our IFS dashboard where you can see all the competitions listed there. Once you click into this competition, it has information on eligibility, scope, dates, how to apply, and supporting information. On the How to Apply tab has every single question with every line of guidance that is attributed to that question. It has links to our general guidance, and it also has links to our project finance guidance. So we've got loads of information there to aid you in putting your application together. But like Ian said, if you don't find that bit of information that you need, please do come to our customer support services. They'll be able to help.
Just to add to that, so this event is also being recorded.
Oh.
So you can go back and review that as well. So there's normally a link put on Julia. Yeah.
We'll make sure the link goes on the date page.
Yes, there will be the recording of these session on the KTN YouTube channel, and we don't have the capacity to answer the question from the people attending via web, but do please get in touch with the customer support at Innovate UK or with us at KTN. We'll be able to get back to any query you might have.
And we'll put the link to the KTN webpage on our date page on today's date. It will have briefing and it will have the link so you can listen to us all again.
So I think there's a question at the back.
What's the VAT situation? Because obviously when we on our academic part, when we do research, we're eligible, but we don't have to pay VAT because we're doing medical research. If we channel it through a company like you say, which we have to, that makes it liable for VAT. So it reduces the amount of throughput we do in projects.
I don't think that's strictly true that you have to be, because it's a research project. Yeah, yes. So the question is around eligibility and VAT costs, particularly if you're subcontracting. So yes, you would have to charge, but you would have to incur VAT if you were to subcontract that work. So it's a question of whether you want to work in a subcontractor relationship or you want to work in a collaborating partnership. That may change that situation because then, of course, the funding flows direct to the company and the VAT is not incurred. It's one of those choices around whether someone is a collaborator or a subcontractor. Yeah. I think there's a question.
You mentioned that a collaboration agreement will need to be provided before the offer letter can be issued. Would a company to provide a draft of that agreement at the submission stage?
We actually, sorry, on our...
question.
Oh, sorry?
We'll just repeat the question.
Oh, you were saying about you need to provide a collaboration agreement before the grant offer letter is issued, and do we provide a template?
No, do you need to provide a draft of the...
Oh, do we provide the draft? Okay. You can actually go on to our How to Apply, and on there it will actually have templates for you. So on the question collaboration, it will actually have a template. You can use that template, or you don't have to use that template. It's completely up to you. And then you have to attach it to the application.
I think it's also worth adding in terms of collaboration agreements. We don't specify what you do. We just insist that you've all signed it and you've agreed to it as a collaborative group. But you can use the templates which are freely available, the Lambert agreements we would direct you to, but then there's no requirement to use that. And large companies will whip out a collaboration agreement as a standard form pretty quickly normally.
Yes, that's right. It's just a template, a guide.
I think the gentleman was actually asking if I drafted that at the submission stage.
Oh, sorry. Did I get myself confused? No. No, you don't at the submission. It's through the project setup, isn't it? So you have to provide it before the grant offer letter is issued. So if you're successful, then, sorry, that's my fault. If you're successful, then you go through the project setup, and within the project setup is your collaboration agreement. There is also a template for your exploitation plan that you will also need to provide. Sorry, that's my fault.
Right, thank you.
There's another question in the back.
Further to that, you've got a pre-existing collaboration agreement with your SME or your companies. Is that count towards this, or do you have to negotiate specific on this call?
So the question is, can you use a pre-existing collaboration agreement? Well, by all means, I think is the answer if you have that collaboration agreement, but you'd have to check that it encompassed the new IP that might be generated by this project, and I suspect that you might want to refresh that element. But as I said, we don't ask for this documentation until you've been awarded the funding. What we're trying to reiterate is that there's a requirement to think ahead, as it were, because people are always very optimistic as to how long that process will take. And another question in the front.
So I have a question about the eligibility. You mentioned that a company would also need to be eligible for state aid. And I saw on your slide, and you mentioned that it means that the company must be more than 3-year-old. So just
that is we have it's called undertakings in difficulty. It's something, again, if you are successful, our project finance team will do checks on. If you are 3 years and under, that's not applicable to you. So it's just...
any startup, really, that started operating a year ago.
Okay, you
will
should
not
be... You wouldn't have this particular test, but we'd still be looking into your viability, and if you're able to provide match funding and such like, we'll still be doing that. But the particular test, and it is on our website, so you can go on, you can link into it and have a read what it is, what it entails, and there. But any companies that are 3 years and less, it's not applicable to them.
So the question was about how long do you have to be a going concern in order to be eligible for funding, and the answer is not very long.
No.
The smallest company that I've dealt with has a single employee, hadn't been going for about a year. It's just really about whether they've got the finances and can demonstrate they have that finance in place. The UID test is a particular element around state aid, which is around preventing countries from subsidising failing or ailing companies which would otherwise maybe become insolvent. So it is a rather crude tool to look at whether the company is truly viable. And what we would say is that companies that do come to a point where they have failed the test, it is an iterative process. So it may well be that the information that is available in the public domain is out of date or doesn't reflect the true financial status of the organisation. So many companies which are awarded funding and fail that test actually subsequently go on to provide sufficient information that we can pass them and allow them to receive funding. But it is around making sure that we're not giving funding to organisations which are in financial distress, really. I don't know if we have any further questions at this stage. No further questions? We've stunned you into silence.
No, that's great.
So is the plan to have a short break, or?
Yes, we are like 10 minutes ahead of time, 5 minutes actually.
Mm-hmm.
So we have 5 extra minutes for networking, and we'll break, and we'll be back at 11 with Genomics England. So we'll have Greg Elgar, she's the director of sequencing at Genomics England, talking here for us. So yeah, I'll see you back here at 11.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And take the opportunity to catch our representative of the EEN before he disappears.
Thank you.
Oh, it's 12.
12.
12. welcome back. It's now my pleasure to introduce you Glenn Elgar, Director of Sequencing at Genomics England. Greg, to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me along. This is slightly late notice for me, but I've kind of been drafted in to try to give you some idea of the scope of Genomics England's involvement in this call and how we can hopefully facilitate both the biological sequencing of and the analysis of cancer samples. And so that's really why I'm here. So I'm going to have a very quick skip through who we are in case some of you don't know. This is a kind of age-old concrete slide that we've had for a number of years now. It just charts very briefly the history of Genomics England after what was a rather gradual start in 2012, 2013, and giving us some time to build the infrastructure for the project. We accelerated very rapidly in the last couple of years. In fact, last year we sequenced about 55,000 whole genomes in a year in partnership with Illumina and our sequencing centre based at Hingston. So that has provided us with a great deal of experience in sequencing at very high throughput, transferring data, developing a high throughput analysis platform, and also learning the best way to interpret and deliver data back to clinicians so that they can then inform patients. And so what we're proposing is that this pipeline, this well-established pipeline and economy at scale pipeline is perfectly suited, particularly as we have a great deal of experience in cancer genomes, to this particular call. So there's a few numbers up there which are now slowing down as we have essentially finished the 100,000 genomes project. The very last 100 or so cancer samples are trickling through the system now, and we're in the process of ramping up for the Genomic Medicine Service at the end of the year and into the beginning of 2020. And so the lessons we've learned there, we've incorporated into our slightly updated, newer pipeline, and so hopefully we'll be able to use that experience to help guide some of these applications through at the most speedy and economical way. So the great thing about this call is that it permits new technologies to be developed, to be tested, but at the same time, it provides the opportunity to generate a very large amount of really valuable genomic data. And so one of the real kind of points of this call is that we gather this data together, and it doesn't just end up being a whole series of very bright but short-lived flowers, and it actually comes together and we generate something that will last. So one way or the other, we would like the data from these applications to end up in the research environment at Genomics England. And this call gives the opportunity to put sequences or samples through our sequencing pipelines. And there's also the potential to do this using long-read sequencing as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. And putting these sequences through becomes part of this kind of grand aspiration that our current government and hopefully future governments will follow through with, to contribute to 5 million genomic analyses by in 5 years' time, or less than 5 years' time now. So we would very much like you to work with us. We hope we can facilitate and enable a great deal of the work that will be undertaken during these calls. So what can we offer you? Essentially, we will be working alongside you, not as a collaborator or a partner, but as a service provider in this model that I'm going to talk about. So we are essentially a sequencing and analytical provider. And this is the kind of support and infrastructure we already have. We have a world-class sequencing pipeline, and it does have economy of scale savings. We have a research environment that is secure, and we have built that on the basis of consultation with the participants of the 100,000 Genomes Project, so we know that it has great kind of support and trust from the public and from patients. Obviously, you already have a huge amount of data, so if you put additional data in, you have a huge database to compare with, and that's really hugely valuable, and we already have a very large number, as you saw, of cancer genomes within the research environment. We have an ever-increasing suite of tools, and you can also port your own tools into the research environment, whether they're new, developmental, or whether you want to actually work on them within the research environment. I should say at this point, Genomics England on these applications are not interested at all in any IP associated with these projects. We are simply a service provider model for this. We have worked very hard on consent models, so we have a consent model that permits follow-up, recontact, and also longitudinal follow-up. And what we have done, as you will see in a minute, is we have tried to enrich the genomic data with a huge amount of secondary data, which is also absolutely invaluable. And we will hope to try and keep those kind of standards for any data that comes into the research environment through this application. So, and of course, yes, there's a huge network of researchers already associated with the research environment. So this gives a kind of overview. I'm not going to go through every single piece on there. Some of the writing's a little bit small for those at the back, but there is a huge amount of data available. And we are constantly looking at enriching that data as well, even down to GP records and hospital visits, etc. There's a huge amount of data in there. So this is a kind of cartoon summary of the research environment and what's available within there and the benefits of using the research environment. You have a great deal of compute. You have lots of tools available. You can bring in your own tools. You can collaborate within that environment. And as I say, there's lots of data, both secondary and primary. So there are various levels of membership which provide you with different levels of access to the research environment from a commercial perspective. This is not my area of expertise, but obviously if you are applying through the application, you can apply, as far as I know, for the costs of using that space on the application. So that's something you might want to consider. There is a great deal of support there, and additional support can be provided. And there are a huge number of potential collaborators, further collaborators within that environment. And when a research project is undertaken within the research environment, it is recorded in the research project registry. So we have a register of all projects. So that can be accessed to see if there's overlap with projects you might be undertaking or you want to undertake. So there is a huge kind of community there that comes with the research environment, which is we're starting to find is more and more valuable. It really has reached a kind of good critical mass now, as of course has the amount of data within there. And that includes the GSIPs, which are now really starting to ramp up. It's taken a while, and Genomics England realise it has taken a while, but in the last year or two, that's really been transformed. So it's a very, very straightforward model, as all high-throughput projects should be. It's the simplest and easiest path. Patient consent is absolutely pivotal in that, because we need to be able to use the data in the ways we want to, and we need the patient to be fully aware of that and consented to it. We have samples plus a great deal of associated data that's collected. So the route we use for samples is that we use the UK biorepository for submitting samples to. That is where samples are normalized in terms of concentration and volume and QC'd, and then they are formatted in sequencing plates that are then sent to the Illumina Centre directly for sequencing. And that's an extremely efficient system that we've developed. We can also archive samples there, and they also have the capability to undertake RNA, DNA extractions if necessary, or you may prefer to identify local partners to do that, which might also link to the way you acquire the samples. So you can use the entire approach here, or there are opportunities if you want to do some of these areas yourself, or it is instrumental to your application that you need to do some of these areas yourself, you can come in at different areas and different parts of the chart. So we've split this up into 3 different methods, but I guess there's kind of hybrids of them. But we can do the end-to-end thing. We can go from sample through to analysis. We can provide an analytical pipeline. We can also provide you with the opportunity to come into the research environment and do your own ad hoc analyses. So there are various points of entry. End-to-end genomes, that's a kind of little summary of that, what we can do. I don't think there's anything that we can't do from that point of view. So we have expertise in most areas. We would have to look at the very beginning if there was collection of specific kinds of tissues, or if there was a particular need for DNA extraction from certain tissue types. We may have to approach more locally where for instance, the genomic medicine centres were now the genomic laboratory hubs, or there may be other kind of labs locally where those extractions can be done. We can advise on what we expect in terms of sequence or DNA quality and the amounts of DNA, and we can also then help in organising the transport through the system from there. As I say, we can archive and we can then sequence. We have essentially a standard sequencing workflow, and because we would very much like all the data in one place to look the same, then we would hope that procedure would be adopted. It's something we've spent a lot of time developing. It's summarised very briefly there, in as much as we do a standard 30x one genome equivalent coverage for the germline, and we do 2.5x, that's around 75x coverage of the tumour. And that is a very good compromise on the amount of granularity and depth you can get from the tumour sequencing against the cost, because obviously when you increase coverage, you significantly increase the cost. We can do adaptations of that, but if it's possible, we would like to stick to that as the main short-read sequencing pipeline. We have a standard pipe, analytical pipe at the moment. We are upgrading that and updating it for the Genomic Medicine Service, and that is something we would hope to have in place for these projects. If not, we have our current pipeline, which we have used for the 100K very successfully. And once the data's in the research environment, there are the normal kind of embargoes that you can put on access to that sequence. We tend to give 9 months exclusivity to that. Okay, and then the analytical pipeline is simply the same circle, but you come in at a different point. I don't really need to go through that again. And then you can just bring your own data into the research environment. Now, what we want to make sure, though, is that data that's ported into the research environment is of the appropriate quality, depth, etc. So we would like those data to conform with our standard quality metrics that we accept data for. And by all means, if this is the route you want to use, please come and talk to us as early as you can so we can make it clear how we'd like to see the data and how we'd like you to bring the data to us. So these are the kind of expectations for the pipeline and for bringing the samples or the data in. Covered most of that. There are always some legal agreements to get round. Genomics England makes this as easy as possible by not wanting to take any IP, but there will be MTAs and there may be some data sharing agreements that need to be ironed out. And where possible, if you can, use a very open consent model. If they're not consented already, we would need to see how that consent model, if it's already been agreed on samples, how that would work in our kind of research environment framework. So a couple of additional things that are really important to mention. We've been working with Nanopore for a little while now, and we do not have a clinical Nanopore pipeline, surprisingly enough. However, we do have a Nanopore machine in-house in our R&D lab at Hinxton in the Sanger Institute. And we are running clinical samples or samples collected as part of the 100K project, for example, through that pipeline. Mostly, or as well as in order to prove various proof of concept, we're also doing that as part of a kind of development pipeline to understand how we can transform what is essentially a research instrument into a full-on clinical pipeline. So we would be happy to work with others if they are looking to do long-read sequencing. We have already worked out how we are going to enter that data into the research environment, and we already have tools in the research environment, and we'd be very happy to work with others who are working on long reads, and I know there are people here who are actually ahead of where we are on long reads, but Nanopore have agreed to partner with us on that. The other area is the sample acquisition, and the experimental cancer medicine centres have agreed in principle to facilitate this and provide a great opportunity for sample acquisition and collection. And so we would hope that if you are looking at possible cohorts, but you haven't looked at the route by which you will collect them, that you will talk to ECMC about that, and they have centres throughout the UK and Scotland. I don't know if they have a Welsh centre, I'm not sure. They do, they have a Welsh centre as well. Okay, so we haven't nailed down the pricing, but that's something we can talk to you individually about, and we will try and develop some price models very soon. So on the, in terms of non-standard proposals, we need an end-to-end proposal if possible. If we can't have that, then we really need to make sure that the data quality is appropriate. And that's the key point here, is that we need to understand how the data is generated, and we need to have some quality metrics on that data. And we need to talk about that again very early on. And so that, I think, is pretty much a summary of the of what I've talked about. I don't think there's anything that I haven't talked about on there. It just summarizes it. And as these slides are going to be made available, I won't spend a great deal of time talking about that. And I've talked about the way we would prefer to see these sequences. So that's how you get in touch with us. There is a direct email to Genomics England for these applications through innovate@genomicsengland.co.uk, which will be picked up by the team that's largely sitting down there, and some of the other of us to kind of guide you through the best way to do this. And that's it from me. And I don't know whether the team, I may have missed something out here, so I don't know, do you want to, is there anything really important that I've missed that you want to shout out now? Yeah, and so I take questions though, although I might bounce them.
I was wondering,
So we have the PromethION.
All right. And
Yeah.
how far are you in the validation of the clinical pipeline on this?
We are at 0.0. So what we have done...
I'm sorry, if you could repeat the questions for the
Sorry. Okay, so it was asked what nanopore instrument we have. So we have a PromethION, and we have been working with it for about 6-7 months now. What we have done is we've essentially been looking at the optimal... we're starting from the beginning, looking at library prep and looking at extraction methods to provide the optimal library.
And you will have to repeat my question, sorry for
Yeah, it's fine.
Did you adapt the specification to this particular chemistry, or you're still at 30x coverage?
So is this for nanopore? Have we adapted the kind of sequence specification? We don't have a set-in-stone specification for nanopore. Whilst conveniently what we're targeting is around 30x on the flow cells, because we're looking to generate around 100 gigabases, at the moment that's not necessarily what we will end up doing. And in fact, one of the opportunities on this proposal, and something that we're very keen to do, is to look at hybrid approaches where we do lower coverage short read and in combination with lower coverage long read. So a lot of this is what is the optimal whole genome sequence for a cancer genome, and it may be different for different cancers. We're also looking at library size from that point of view as well.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Okay.
Did you say that you've only just started to establish the clinical cohort? Did I hear that?
The clinical cohorts for what in particular?
For cancer genome sequencing.
So we have, in a partner call to this, we are sequencing a number of large existing cancer cohorts, but that's a separate call to this, a separate application. So for this call, it is up to the applicants to define the cohorts that they want to bring to Innovate and to Genomics England.
So if one wanted to bring viral-driven cohorts of a particular sort like HPV and another apparently oncogenic virus, one could do that. Let's go.
So it's not for me to define the scope, it's more for Innovate and Ian, but if they were considered oncogenic, then I imagine potentially that's within the remit of the scope. That's something I think you'd have to talk to Innovate and the team at Innovate about. But yes, the cohorts have not been defined in any way whatsoever, as far as I understand it. Except they have to be cancer related.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely right. I think there are opportunities to define new cohorts, but I think it's also worth reiterating that there's a significant data set held by Genomics England already, and I think that you have a reasonable catalogue of what's there and how that was collected, and that may already include some of the samples that you're interested in. I think it's hard to tell.
Yeah.
That's at 38,000
Yes,
samples.
so we have, as part of the 100,000 Genomes Project, collected cancers across the entire cancer spectrum. These have been from all the genomic medicine centres across Great Britain, and they include, as I say, virtually every kind of cancer, because one of the key things we wanted to do during the project was to open up pathways for fresh frozen tumours from all different sources, and that was a major challenge. So we have experience, and we have very, very close links to cancer clinicians, which again, if that's something that's of value, then please do contact us, because we still have cancer clinicians seconded to us, and we have meetings with them every week. So we do have our own kind of access pathways to various cancer cohorts.
So I just had a question about the secondary data that you talked about. So things like S, for instance. So you have a way that you're linking patient genomes to their associated
Yeah.
data.
That's correct, and that's within the research environment, yes. Yeah.
And what coverage for the 100,000 do you have? How many people?
Ooh, good question. Someone else might be able to answer that in more detail.
Over 90-95%. Excellent. But and this is why we mentioned that the consent is important, because ideally for everything that comes in, we would like to be able to also link it with all the other data via the NHS IDs.
Yeah.
In order to make it better for all the assessors, ultimately.
Yeah, and all those channels have been opened, and that's the thing. So we have a route to access those as long as the consent allows it.
And does that include primary and tertiary care as well?
At the moment, it is from hospital statistics data. But we're working on linking, as was mentioned earlier, primary data from GPs and from pharmacies. We're hoping that this will come in 2020, but we cannot, be sure at this stage.
Okay, so well, we're all here for lunch and for later on, so please do come and annoy us. Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg, and to the Genomics England team. They will be around later today to discuss with you. Now, Dr. Mark Davis from the Medicine Discovery Catapult. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks so much. So thank you firstly to the KTN network for arranging this event, for the opportunity to come and talk to you. I'm Mark Davis. I'm here on behalf of the Medicines Discovery Catapult. Today I'm going to give you a little bit of a presentation about what the Medicines Discovery Catapult is, what we're there for, and then to give us sort of a bit of a flavour of some of the things that we find quite exciting and some of the areas that we're looking to work on, looking to collaborate on, and that's really the main area of what interests us, is the ability to find opportunities to work with partners in order to support them in their questions. So as it says on the slide here, one of the aspects that we're providing is access to the sort of hard-to-access scientific capabilities. So the types of technologies, the type of instrumentation, for instance, that particularly those micro companies, that person of one, for instance, is unlikely to have a mass spec imaging machine, for instance, or those types of technologies. And we don't want that to be a preventative problem for those companies. We want them to be able to ask those questions, and we want to work with those people so that they can actually access the capabilities, even as a very small company. The other side that we play is very much this sort of gateway, this signposting, so being able to sort of point people in the right direction if we don't have those capabilities ourselves. We do have some really interesting capabilities, but we don't cover it all, nor do we want to sort of compete with companies who are already well providing that technology. So a lot of what we'll do is also to do signposting to say, if you're after that, then you might want to go and speak to this company in the UK. So just to go into a little bit more detail about the focus of MDC on the drug discovery pipeline, we're not there. What we're not doing is generating our own drugs. We've not got our own drug pipeline. We're there as an enabler. We're there as a supporting player for other companies to do this type of work. Nor are we there to sort of to go and repeat what other people are already well doing. As I say, in those sort of instances, we'd be more than happy to do that signposting. But what we are there to do is to list the problems. We're very excited about what the problems that people are trying to tackle, and sort of helping people to sort of to find ways of doing that. So, what type of capabilities do we have within the Medicines Discovery Catapult? We split roughly into sort of 5 sections, 5 themes within the MDC, the Discovery Science and Technology. This is very much focused towards our more lab-based capabilities. We have sort of ability to do tissue culture, for instance, sort of organ-on-a-chip technologies, etc. Also, we have sort of imaging capabilities, mass spec imaging capabilities. We then have an informatics team, and today I'm going to be talking a bit more about the informatics capabilities. This is very much about developing algorithms to bring the sort of the technologies, and really I think to offer that appropriateness of, we all hear about AI technologies, for instance. We want to make sure that people are using that in an appropriate way, that is suitable for the questions that they're trying to ask. We also have a group that's called the Samples and Data, as we all know, as we've heard before, finding where appropriate data sets and finding where primary and difficult to obtain samples. It's a very fragmented network, and we want to sort of support organizations to be able to access those capabilities. Sometimes that is literally just taking people and helping them through the process of applying, and sometimes it is to sort of map out that landscape. And I'll talk a little bit more about them as well. The virtual R&D organization, this is very much about helping particularly those small companies with how do you take a compound right through to potentially first-time-in-man studies, for instance. That's something that not every company is going to have the capability to do, but we provide that network that people can actually sort of take their assets right through to sort of first-time-in-man, and we'll help them along that pipeline. And then the syndicates is an area which is quite new to us, and this is where we're developing large collaborative efforts, particularly in the sort of support for the charity sector. So I don't need to tell this audience about that increasing need for scientific collaboration. I mean, part of what we're here today is about sort of looking at forming collaborative applications for the purpose of this grant funding. Team science is very much the way to go. Funding calls are, requiring team science. When you look at publications, for instance, and if you go and look at this paper, which came out last year in Science, this shows the sort of the growth in the number of authors that you typically get in publications. So there's a recognition that really great science, you need to bring different disciplines to the table and to work collaboratively in order to tackle actually those really hard problems, not only in drug discovery, but in sort of biology. We also recognize that drug discovery is increasingly becoming a data science approach. And the analysis and the appropriate use of some of the technologies and algorithms open to us is a really important aspect, and that's one of the areas that our informatics team are very strong in. So who do we help? Well, we help the UK SME and biopharma sector. We have different types of companies who might come and partner with us. So we have companies, particularly from a technology space, who might wanting to be sort of access the sort of biological and the lab-based capabilities within the MDC. We have companies who are more focused on the biological aspects, who might be wanting to more partner with the sort of informatics, with the technological aspects of MDC. And across all of those types of organizations that we work with, we bring actually the breadth of experience that we have within the MDC with many years of sort of pharmaceutical and biotech and academic sort of capabilities. So we understand the field, we understand those sort of pinch points, those pain points of industry, and we're trying to sort of leverage that back to the community. And one of the roles that I play is to go out and make sure I'm talking to those companies to make sure that actually the problems that we're trying to tackle are those ones that are most pressing. It comes back to the point that I think Ian made earlier, which is understanding the people, understanding the SMEs in the sector and what those pain points are. So very briefly about samples and data, because I think it's a very relevant aspect at the moment. We ran a survey or ran a report recently. We were asking this question about what people perceive as some of the barriers and some of the challenges in the area of data and samples. And to sort of, there's lots of different colours here, which is about how people have responded. But the key messages here are for biosamples, which is this top bar, and for data, which is this bar here. There was a strong expectation from the people we interviewed that data and samples is an important aspect that people want to be able to use more of. But the corresponding bar underneath each one is the recognition that these are not easy to access resources. So the complexity of sort of accessing the data and samples was seen to be high. And this disconnect, we need it, but it's hard to do. We want to sort of improve with our organizations. We've recently put out a report that's based on some of this work, and that's on our website. That came out last week, actually, really just sort of reflecting back what we're hearing from the SME sector about data access. So what do? We do the signposting. We're doing a lot of work which is to do the horizon scanning. Where are the data sets? Where are the opportunities to go and find samples and data? Particularly in those data sources, we're there to provide availability reports, so helping people to sort of cover the space that they need to do to be able to know which fields they need to fill in those application forms and what things they need to have in place within their own organisations. This is just to reflect a little bit about, particularly coming back to the topic of today, which is sort of cancer and omics. The ability to identify biomarkers is an absolutely critical aspect, and that's something we're quite strong on within that discovery science and technology organisation, that theme within the MDC, where we're helping to identify biomarkers that people can then take through, particularly from those that are available from sort of samples that you can relatively easily collect. And we have a number of technologies that we're using, including nanostring and mass spec, to be able to sort of help to make those quantifications of those biomarkers. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next 10-15 minutes going into a little bit more detail about the informatics capabilities within the MDC, to give you some of the thoughts that we're sort of having, some of the projects that we're starting to develop, and that we're really quite excited to be able to sort of then talk to partners and talk to collaborators about, that I think are going to be relevant for this particular call. So I finally got to the title of the presentation, which is about delivering informatics approaches. And it's very much this appropriateness, which is there's a lot of informatics, there's a lot of AI, machine learning algorithms, but knowing which one to use and for which problems is the more tricky bit, is the more nuanced bit, and that's where we really want to sort of to help out. So coming back to that point again about medicine's R&D is fundamentally as a data scientist, how you do analyze the data. There's a huge amount of data that's already been sort of assessed, and part of what we do with it at MDC is to kind of couple those data sets together such that you're looking at the totality of data rather than sort of little niche aspects. And by looking at that sort of broader option, and it was really exciting just with that question before from Genomics England, this coupling of these different data sets is a really key aspect for being able to start making sort of interpretations and understanding why some patients have a response and others don't, for instance. So we kind of split into sort of three relatively broad sections, which have sort of interpreted as these gears in this figure here. It's pretty difficult to see the text actually on here, but essentially it's this sort of data search. What data could we access? The data capturing, just because you could find a resource doesn't necessarily mean you can then sort of access it, but being able to take that data and put it into well-structured databases, for instance, that makes that recall a little bit easier for the interpretation, and the questions that you want to ask of the data is an aspect that we cover quite a lot within our group. And then finally, I think that really interesting bit is then applying that data in a well-structured form to the questions that are being asked. So really helping those domain experts, those clinicians, for instance, to be able to ask those questions in a timely way such that they can iterate through those questions quite quickly. What we don't want is to avoid the situation where clinicians and people are asking questions and have to wait 6 months to get the data analysis back to them. We want that to be to be timely. We want it to be able to allow them to answer the questions quickly such that they can ask that next question. And it's the asking of successive questions that's going to allow us to drive some of these problems forward. And over here on the right is just some of the types of sort of questions that we hear from people and that we're trying to tackle. But this is not, these are just exemplars. They're not complete. So coming back very much to the focus of today, which is about the omics analysis with the application to cancer.
We have capabilities in-house. In fact, one of our informatics team, Andre, is here in the audience today. He would be more than happy to talk to people during the networking groups and the lunchtime about some of the capabilities. I'm certainly no expert in this, but over here on the left-hand side, we've got the informatics, the bioinformatics capabilities to be able to do that sort of sequence alignment. Importantly, what we're wanting to do with this type of analysis is to be able to identify those mutations that might be relevant. There are many mutations. Being able to interpret which of those mutations are relevant for cancer or for the response to drug is the kind of the challenging and taxing bit, and that's the bit that we'd like to sort of help. And I'll talk a little bit about that over the next couple of slides. One area that I think sort of comes back to that question earlier before, which we find quite interesting, is not only is essentially the patient genomes that we're looking at, but it's also the corresponding sort of viral and pathogen and microbiome sort of genomes that are associated with us. And there's a lot of information that's coming out that talks about the relevance of why understanding our interactions with the microbiota is very important, both from a development of cancer, but also from our response to drugs too. And as a segue into this slide, this is a plot. Again, it's tricky. You'll have the slides, so I encourage you to take a look at this. But this is a infographic that's come from the Cancer Atlas. And if you go in there, it talks very much about the breakdown of actually known pathogenic drivers of cancers over here. Oh my goodness, it really is tiny. But we're all familiar with HPV infections, for instance, in ovarian cancers, for instance, and the ability that actually creating drugs that are there to sort of prevent these viruses and these pathogens can essentially sort of significantly reduce or even eradicate many of these cancers. And these are just a couple of those viruses that have been associated with known cancers. It's not just the viruses. There's a paper here that's very recently come out in Nature. This is the News and Views section. There's an associated article here talking about fungal infections and its role in sort of the development of pancreatic cancer, for instance. So we think there's a real opportunity here to explore further this sort of this microbiota sort of interaction and how that might be impinging on the development of cancer, and that's some work that's going on in our labs at the MDC. I think not only that is this, and this paper comes from Science from last year, which was a very interesting study. That's not there's a number of studies like this that have looked at the microbiota and how that's influencing the response of drugs as well. So this paper, for instance, was looking at PD-1 based immunotherapies and how the response of a patient to these conditions is modified based on in this case the microbiome, the gut microbiome of those patients. So I think this is another interesting sort of aspect. There's kind of two ways to look at this. There's not only the microbiota sort of essentially driving cancer, but there's also the microbiota sort of influencing the subsequent treatment of cancer, and particularly with these immuno-oncology sort of efforts, the ability to avoid those kind of nasty adverse events that can sometimes respond is a key aspect. When we do that sort of sequence analysis, obviously one of the things that we're trying to find is the relevant mutations that are important. And within our labs, we have a lot of focus on trying to sort of stratify or prioritize which mutations are most relevant for drug discovery. This is a well-known mutation, for instance, in the EGFR, where that mutation, that T790M mutation, actually is critical for the binding of erlotinib into the active site, into the EGFR molecule, and that's a bioinformatics approach to take
But you can take this one step further, which is just to say, well, actually, you could almost pre-compute what the mutations might be and what consequence that might be having on your drug binding. And we do that by sort of calculating the free energy of binding of those molecules, of those drugs, into the targets of interest. But essentially, this becomes a sort of computational approach where you can start looking at the potential impacts, and that becomes a particularly important aspect for then being able to sort of make an interpretation of those variants of unknown significance, for instance. So being able to say that actually this particular mutation, which is currently sort of, if you like, orphaned, might become relevant if we know which drug is going to be indicated for treatment. And this is an area that we have some expertise within the team. So that's a sort of quick coverage of two of the more interesting topics, I think, of direct relevance to the call today. I think more generally, the sort of informatics team recognise the importance of this capturing of data and really being able to sort of merge data sets and sort of be able to sort of link across different data sets. And this is an interesting example of just some of the challenges that I think we all face with our research, which is a single publication. It's a Nature paper out of interest. But the data that sits from that paper can be reposited in different sites. So, for instance, data might be put into public repositories. It might form a CSV file as the supplementary material. Significant amounts of data from papers sits within the images and the tables of those papers. And so from a single publication, we've got data that is distributed across different systems. And that's great when you're wanting to read a single paper. That's harder to challenge when you're wanting to read 1,000 papers. And so we recognize that, and we're sort of doing some work in that space to sort of help people to access the totality of that data again. I guess another aspect which is particularly interesting for the MDC sort of drivers, which is to really sort of help and connect and to signpost the network within the UK, is that understanding of who does what in those organisations. The sort of the biopharma sort of capabilities is more fragmented, so people are working within smaller organisations, but being able to know who does what and what capabilities are available, I think is a really key aspect, and something that we're working on in an area that we're referring to as the sort of search capabilities. And so we have some tools that we're developing to be able to build sort of knowledge graphs and sort of semantic search to be able to help people access who does what within the UK within particular technologies. I think similar to that is the pipeline, the drug flight path through drug discovery. We all know that this is a long and costly pipeline, and it's fraught with the pitfalls and areas where things will drop out. So being able to understand how drugs have sort of moved through that pipeline in the past is very informative for telling us how you might approach it in the future. And one aspect of that is to connect up and understand the bioactivity data that you can assess from drugs that have previously gone through those pipelines, in order to be able to sort of understand the kind of the thresholds and the decision making that gets made throughout drug discovery. And the way of sort of almost thinking about that is essentially almost like a GPS for drug discovery. So rather than the sort of, the guiding of that flight path for a plane from one airport to the other, you might sort of want to know what the likelihood of sort of transitioning through the different stages of drug discovery are going to be, knowing that we're starting off with, sort of high throughput, relatively low cost assays, at the start of those drug discovery pipelines, but moving across to, extremely expensive human studies, but which have, increasing disease relevance and importance for marketing and regulatory approval. But knowing what the likely transition stages is going to be is a key aspect that companies are going to need to know, and so that's something that we're looking to develop. So I'm going to finish finally with one, I think, quite nice example that we've done recently within the informatics team, which is in supporting
the Multiple Sclerosis Society, the MS Society, and in this case, this was a question about drug repurposing. So the challenge that they came to us with was, we know that there's a bunch of drugs that we can use for the purpose of MS. We'd like to know what other drugs might be available to help us sort of reach the patients who really need it. And we took an informatics approach, which was to understand from the existing MS drugs which drugs were hitting which targets, and then expanded out the chemistry space in order to then sort of deliver back to that team what other drugs and what other approved drugs might be available to them from indications other than MS. And so what we did, this picture here is essentially the funnel where we extracted information from clinical trials of drugs that have been used in MS. We understood by using a bioinformatics approach which mechanisms, which targets were being part of those drugs, and then we kind of sort of triaged and expanded out the potential chemistry space in order to be able to sort of deliver back a set of novel compounds that haven't been previously used, but could be repurposed for the purpose of MS. And the outcomes that we delivered there was a data table essentially that allowed the clinicians, the experts in MS there, to be able to look through them and to be able to understand and make further prioritizations based on that completeness of the data, which is things like, well, actually you need to know what it's binding to, what its physical ADMET properties, its routes of administration, and then critically those things like what are the associated adverse events, what are the drug label warnings, what do we know about the co-medications and comorbidities, etc., and how we can use that information to help us prioritize which drugs we might want to take forward. So with that, I think I'm still a little bit ahead of time, so which is good. I'll stop there. I'll pause. I'll take any questions. These are the details for making contact with us, or come and speak to myself, Andre, in the audience during the lunch. And thanks for your time.
You talked very good about infection, which is clearly extremely important, but metabolic factors, which act as carcinogenic process, maybe like in obesity or diabetes or inflammatory disorders. I mean, how much have you looked at those as co-carcinogens?
So the question was about viral and microbiota infections are important for driving cancer, but there are many other biological pathways that can also cause cancer, and the question was about metabolism, for instance, and how much have we looked into that. So the question is only a little, but that is, if that is something of particular interest to you, that would be definitely something that would encourage a further conversation with. Ultimately, we're there not to tell you what the right methods are to do it, but to listen and to work with you to sort of help you to sort of achieve those goals. So if that is an area of particular interest, we'd really like to encourage a conversation where we think about that problem. Okay, well, we're here all day, so we can take questions outside as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Mark. And the next speaker is Dr. Andrew Biggs from the ECMC Experimental Cancer Medicine Centres. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Andrew Beggs. I'm local. It's very good. It only took me 10 minutes to get here this morning because the hospital is literally 2 stops away on the train, which makes life a lot easier to get here. I'm a clinician scientist and I sit on the committee for our Birmingham ECMC, the adult one. But my background, my expertise is in genomic medicine and translational cancer models as well. But I'm going to talk to you about the ECMC and how it can help with this research for people who are interested. The ECMC is, I'm not just saying this because the ECMC have asked me to say it, it's a very good network you can use for your research. It gives you an access into
patients throughout the UK and Wales, as we've said, through these networks here. And the map doesn't project very well, but you can sort of see here there are various ECMCs scattered around the UK. The yellow dots are the adult ECMCs, for those of you who can't see it. The pink dots are the paediatric ones, and the blue ones are both. So there are quite a few centres around with both. We're both. There are ones down in London, Newcastle, Glasgow. And they're a network of unique centres. They integrate the NHS and academia. So they're not just academic centres with academic oncologists. They actually fully integrate the NHS pipeline, so access to patients, access to data, access to trials, access to drugs, and access to integrating them all together. We'd like to think we have clinical, scientific and operational expertise, because a lot of the trials that are done in this scenario run through the ECMC network, and the network is encouraged to work with each other. So it's not just one centre working in isolation. We all try and engage with each other to run these trials across the network rather than being run in one centre if we have the capacity. And the advantage is this means you have a single point of entry to facilitate engagement with us, to see if we can do it feasibly or not. We know the capabilities across the ECMC, not just from trial delivery, but also from access to patients, types of cancers that we're involved with, access to sample types, fresh frozen FFPE, ctDNA, whatever you like. And also we have banks of academics across multiple tumour types, and also not just tumours, but data, pharmacology, drugs, drug development that could be used to progress innovation. And there's an infrastructure budget of about 7 million that's distributed across the centres. For instance, at my centre, the ECMC pays for people involved with the trial development, the managing of the trials. Also, it pays for somebody who's a biomarker development scientist who can take a biomarker through from concept to reality. It also pays for various other things that can be used as part of an interaction with an ECMC network. There are different ways to engage with it, but there are different leads. And for those of you, some of you may be familiar with some of the people who are names on here, and they all have their specific tumours of interest. For instance, in Birmingham, ours is led by Gary Middleton, who, as you know, runs the Lung Matrix study, which is a very large study of targeted therapy in lung cancer. And through that, our ECMC cancers of interest are lung cancer, colorectal, brain, trying to think what others, head and neck, esophagogastric as well. But other ECMCs may or may not focus on other cancers as necessary. We also have a paediatric ECMC network run by Pam Kearns, who's our new Institute Director, and Bruce Moore and Andrew Peat, who's our Professor of Neuroimaging. And so we obviously have access to that as well. And to give an example of for instance, I'm going to be very biased towards Birmingham, but I can only speak about what we can offer really. We have a fully integrated electronic patient record. So within the Birmingham ECMC, there's no paper. All patient records, including clinical noting, even down granularity, such as what the patient's blood pressure is for every minute of the time they're in the hospital, heart rate, what drugs they're given, the time of the drugs, drug toxicity, stuff like that is all integrated, is all available electronically that could be transferred as part of the ECMC network. Our ECMC is also set up as part of GEL, actually, an image sharing platform where we can share imaging across multiple modalities all the way across the entire network and export it to other providers in order for downstream analysis. And this could be linked back to the genomic data, and patients go within this network with a centralized ID. So what can the network provide? We have the main point of the ECMC is a site with expertise in experimental cancer medicine. So a lot of this is obviously driven by oncology. We have many clinicians with expertise across all cancer types and all age groups. And we recruit over 3,000 people to early phase studies. And these are the most difficult ones to recruit to, because you need to be able to identify the right patient. You need to identify the drug that's going to be suitable for them. And more importantly, you need to have the capacity from a clinical point of view to manage the problems that you get as a consequence of these trials. So, for instance, once again, in the West Midlands, we are set up to deliver immunotherapy and cell therapy trials. We have a cell therapy unit, an immunotherapy unit. And as we know from previous immunotherapy trials, there can be some quite profound side effects. So we're set up to manage with dedicated intensive care beds the consequences of immunotherapy. And so we can offer that entire patient journey all the way from recruiting to phase 1 trials, dealing with the complications, liaising you from the genomic medicine point of view, and also helping set up studies within it, collecting samples. Now, one of the other things to bear in mind, and this is our flag waving here once again, within the ECMC network, most of the ECMC centres are part, well, all of them actually, are part of the 100,000 Genomes project and collect samples. Of the cancer samples, I know that the West Midlands has collected quite a few, as well as London, and these samples, these patients are all known to us in the ECMC, and so we can integrate and feedback with data with that. And I think, I may be wrong, but I think we've collected about 6,000 cancer samples across the West Midlands Genomic Medicine Centre. So, you know, we've shown a track record of being able to collect frozen tissue samples, blood samples, ctDNA, ascites we've collected for somebody else, and we can pass it back to people. And a lot of the other ECMCs have this sort of facility. Not all of them, but most of them have a facility to get frozen tissue, to get FFPE, to get blood, whatever you need, and filter it back as part of a patient network. The studies that we do, 70% of them are commercially sponsored and 30% academically sponsored. And the advantage of having high-profile academics, as you saw in the previous slides, is that pharma will tend to approach those academics as their entry point into the ECMC. So, for instance, Long Matrix has about 40 different stratified agent combinations, and that has been basically built because of the relationships that CR UK, the ECMC, Gary Middleton have established with pharma in order to introduce these patients into targeted therapy trials. And the other issue around, where I've sort of mentioned that, is that we have the experience and the capability to collect samples for WGS. So going forwards with this type of call, where we're talking specifically about WGS, a lot of the ECMC centres have already been collecting samples as part of the 100,000 Genomes project, quality assured. And actually, I would argue the more important thing, in addition to collecting samples, is a lot of us have also got the pipelines for feeding back results to patients. So in the West Midlands, for instance, we have a well-developed pipeline for feeding back the results to patients and acting on them. And we've already found, we've already found quite a number of actionable variants that have already fed back into phase 1 trials and immunotherapy trials. Now, the great thing about the ECMC, the many great things, but one of the great things is a dedicated program office that can support your companies in accessing the network, and some of them are in the audience. And we can, because we know we have a capabilities database of who can do what, that we can expedite access to interested sites and investigators and collaborate with you within days or even shorter, because most people will know what we can do. And it will also help with feasibility and site selection for entry into trials, for collection of samples, for collection of data of any kind. And this sort of leads us to say, well, what does your average ECMC patient look like? Well, they generally come in by a phase 1 clinic, and most ECMCs will have these or have them in setup. And they will, it says usually, almost inevitably, they will have had at least 1 or more rounds of therapy, chemoradiotherapy, surgery, immunotherapy, combinations of all of the above. And they're facing disease progression of relapse. And these are some of the people who have already been going into the 100,000 Genomes project when they've had surgery on the background of metastatic disease. And so one of the things we've already found as working with GEL is that we've been able to use the results from GEL to feed back entry into phase 1 trials, which is extremely useful because sometimes they're the patient's only treatment option. For instance, in colorectal, which is my cancer of interest, there are very few good drug targets for patients beyond immunotherapy. And the data we already get back from GEL allows us to identify novel phase 1 trials that the patient may be able to enter to. It also allows us to, the other thing to mention, the GEL ethics also, and our own ethics, allows us to resample patients at any stage during the process. So we can sample patients when they're on treatment. So we have an industrial study going at the moment where patients undergoing chemoradiation get biopsied every 2 days, which sounds unpleasant, but the patients have gone for it, for their rectal cancer. So we can collect linear samples as well. And we've got the ability to process other samples like ctDNA, or in ovarian cancer, we can do ascites sampling and spin down and provide cell pellets. And the ECMCs are usually funded to be able to provide that kind of tissue for the downstream assays. Now, one of the issues with these patients is although they have good performance status, i.e. they can have the drugs because they're fit enough to have it, they usually have a very poor prognosis between 3 to 6 months. And so they can deteriorate quickly. Now, they will have had tissue taken at diagnosis, and it's almost always going to be formalin fixed, but once again, this is ECMC centric. So for instance, if you come, once again, flag waving, if you come to the West Midlands ECMC, all patients within the West Midlands ECMC have fresh frozen tissue taken at surgery and banked for future use, and with generic ethics to be used to anything that you can apply for. And other ECMCs do this as well. They do it in London, they do it in Oxford. So there are it's not just about for formalin fixed tissue. You can access fresh frozen tissue in the appropriate network, but you can also access it going forwards as well. And patients can be matched to trials based on the eligibility criteria, and it could be disease type, which a lot of the ECMCs have computerized now, and so they can pull up a list of patients who may have that disease type that you might be interested in, and they also have molecular markers available. Given that depending on the cancer type, there's molecular pathology already available outside GEL, but even within GEL, patients can be identified. Now, one of the issues that many early phase trials require rebiopsy for entry to the study, whether it's because the company wants to run their own proprietary assay or whether they want to see whether resistance has developed. And these can be facilitated as part of the ECMC rebiopsy because most of these ECMCs are centred around large teaching hospitals. They have the ability to provide image-guided biopsy for harvesting of tissue and also the consent of the patients and looking after them afterwards because these kind of biopsies are not without risk. And all ECMC locations have access to molecular phase testing for phase 1 patients for access with trials. So, for instance, your standard molecular pathology stuff on the test directory like KRAS, BRAF, BRCA testing can all be provided as part of this. But none has standard access to WGS at the moment. GEL is changing. Things are changing such that there will hopefully be testing going forwards of WGS and metastatic disease, but that's the next phase of the project, which will be coming in due course. But the centres that already have experience of providing samples of WGS can have the infrastructure still in place to provide samples going forwards. So what do we get out of it? That's the question. We're interested in collaborating as ECMC investigators because we want to generate data that's clinically meaningful in a clinically relevant time frame. So what's that time frame? We've put it lower down on the slide. Ideally, sequencing data needs to be returned in 12 days, which is an ambitious target. We know GEL can meet it with we had a result return the other day from GEL. I asked our GEL people this morning about it, so we can turn it around relatively quickly. But we want it returned in a format that allows us to identify actionable mutations. So those of you, for instance, have seen the GEL pipeline, you get tiered variants, as with many clinical reports, but there are other ways to do tiering of variants. We have worked on nanopore sequencing. We developed our own tiered variant report for nanopore sequencing, but there are other things that are important, for instance, for immunotherapy. You want to know tumour mutational burden, and the GEL pipeline provides that, and other pipelines provide that. And this will help you match patients with the trials. Now, what is important is that when this does happen, to feed it back, and we've heard earlier about how the data will be fed back into GEL, and that will be useful from our point of view as clinicians in order to see if any subsequent trials come along, what we can recruit people into for. One of the things we have said is that if you do want to collect an additional sample, for instance, you want to do a scan, or you want to do another biopsy, or you want to extract DNA from a sample, it has to be part of the Innovate UK award. We don't have a budget. The ECMC budget, although good, cannot, I have to say that with them in the audience, we always want more money, it cannot cover the cost of routine sample acquisition for these studies. You have to build it into your grant because a biopsy, especially an image-guided biopsy, can be quite expensive, depending on where it is, whether it's CT or ultrasound-guided, depending how many calls you want. It can be quite expensive, so that needs to be, I would suggest you talk to the ECMCs early if you want to arrange tissue sampling about how much that will cost. But we can do it. Now, the way that we're proposing people will match WGS data to patient trials is by using the Trial Finder tool that's unique to the ECMC, and the whole purpose of it is to allow you to take your actionable variant, as it's called, match it into a trial that may be occurring with the ECMC network. So, for instance, one of the issues with using something else like clinicaltrials.gov is that when you put a mutation into clinicaltrials.gov, you're usually presented with about 200 trials, as we know from our experiences, of which probably about one is open and one is in another country. So it's not very useful from the point of view of your time and working out who's suitable for what. So what we suggest is using the Trial Finder tool will allow you to show what's going in the UK now, what the eligibility criteria are. And as it says quite rightly here, one of the issues, as I've alluded to, is lack of visibility of early phase trials. These may be running, but for instance, there's a slightly later phase trial called Foxtrot running at the moment that doesn't seem to be in any clinical trials databases, but it's got 1,000 patients in it, bizarrely. So sometimes we're reliant on clinical trials units to put these trials into a database, which doesn't always happen. But this database should be up to date because as a part of the ECMC network, we have to regularly feed back which trials we've got open within the ECMC. And it's easy to use. You search, I've used it, and then you get a contact recruit, and then you can easily rapidly decide who's going to go in. And the data's updated on a monthly basis. So this should allow you to recruit patients to trials faster using your assay of choice. So how do we allow industry access to the network? There's a standard sort of template that we use. Non-disclosure agreement takes 5 days, an expression of interest, feasibility, whether we think it's going to work or not, and then site selection. And this can all be carried out in collaboration with the Secretariat of the ECMC who run it in the programme office. And it is generally a very straightforward process. We want to collaborate, we want to help. We want to get our patients to go into interesting trials or have interesting methodologies done on them. And so hopefully you should find it's a seamless process. As we all know, contracting is never a seamless process, but we'll try and do our best to make it as painless as possible. Now, we've got a suggested a draft of how it could work for people who need tissue samples as part of the ECMC network that I'm going to present. I just want to emphasise it's only draft, but it's just a suggested a pipeline to be able to get in to us. So if you're an SME and you want to get some tissue samples, which we already know a lot of SMEs do, we get approached all the time, what's the best way to establish that? Well, what you should do is contact the ECMC program office, which you'll see at the end. And then we'll have an internal discussion about whether it's feasible and we can identify interested collaborators. What we'll then do is we'll also have a conversation with our precision medicine working group about whether what we're proposing to do on this tissue sample is feasible. So for instance, if you want to do whole genome sequencing on let's think of the most unlikely thing you could do it on, a fine needle aspirate or an EBUS sample from a lung cancer with about 5 cells in it, probably not going to work. So that you sometimes need a bit of a reality check to understand that. And we, outside the gel, get approached about unlikely things like that all the time, i.e. can you do whole genome sequencing on a single cell? And, well, we can, but you won't like it. So sometimes we would suggest there needs to be a bit of reality check with our precision medicine group about whether this would fit in the pipeline. And then obviously, as we've heard already, there's a choice of providers around. There's gel, but you may have another sequencing provider you want to use. But the whole point of this proposed access point is if you involve us early, we can tell you about your project. Is it actually feasible or not? Do the samples you want to get, will you actually be able to, given what we know about what we've supplied, will you be able to get meaningful data out of them? Will you be able to actually supply this data and use it for your trials? And so we're very happy to help with that. And it's sort of an iterative process. We're never going to say, no, you can't do that. But we may actually say, have you thought that you might want to do this, this, or this to make it easier? So that's it, really. If you want to contact the program office, they're sitting at the back, in the middle there. Aoife and see, they're sitting there, and they're the experts. There's a website you can look at, and it's got more details of the ECMC networks. There's an email address as well you can contact. And also there's the Combinations Alliance, and the reason we put the Combinations Alliance on that's obviously a way to apply for funding to try novel drug combinations, and I'm involved with some Combinations Alliance trials as well. And so you can use this it's a partnership with industry, so AstraZeneca, Merck, MSD, BMS, various other, Ono, the amazingly named Ono Pharmaceuticals, Insight, various other pharma industry partners collaborate in this Combinations Alliance, so it's mainly AstraZeneca, and they can provide access to novel agents that you can use in your early phase trials. So if you have an idea, it's worth thinking about them as well. And that's it. Well done for keeping your patients before lunch. Any questions? You're struck dumb.
It's interesting to do single cell analysis. We just said we can't.
Well,
amplify the genome sufficiently to get meaningful material.
well, we have our own internal non-clinical pipeline for whole genome sequencing on single cells that we wouldn't say it's fit for clinical release yet. And it's a proprietary method as well. It's being IP'd at the moment. Great. Fantastic. Everybody wants lunch.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you to Greg and Mark. And again, Andrew, they have very clearly outlined how they can collaborate with companies and academics alike to participate in this competition. So thank you very much again to our keynote speakers. We will break now for lunch for an hour. And the webcast won't be resumed after lunch, but we will have companies and academics pitching for us and a little bit of networking afterwards. So thank you very much for those that have joined us online. And again, the webcast will be available on the KTN website, KTN YouTube channel rather. If you have any questions, just reach out to myself. I'm Giulia Boselli from the Knowledge Transfer Network, or to the support team at Innovate UK. And thank you very much.